Good afternoon, everyone. Before we get started, does anybody have any questions from the previous lecture? Okay, cool. Just wanted to ask, just because I know a couple of people are having a little bit of trouble with Punnett squares, and I know I talked to a couple of students about it, but in case anybody wanted further clarification, I'm happy to show y'all in a little bit more of a drawn out way. As always, Quiz 9's due on Sunday. Next exam is coming up rather soon. It'll be Friday, November 5th, with a review session held kind of similarly what we've done previously. Like last time, we'll do it hybrid approach as far as the test goes. So if you want to take it in person, you can. If you want to take it online, you can. However works for you is the best. I'm going to print out a good bit more copies this time just to be safe. We had about 106 people take it in person, so I'll aim for about 200 just to give us quite a fair bit of breathing room for those of y'all that had like computer issues and would just rather take it in person. That's fine by me. But do kind of plan to give me a heads up just so I can still keep track of the numbers, just in case 200 isn't enough and I can scramble to find more copies. Also, for those of y'all that took the test through SAS last time, they're being really slow. I'm sorry, I'll get it uploaded as soon as I can. Also, for those of y'all that have already either taken it either in person or online from the previous exam, those grades should be up and correct. If they are not, let me know. Give me some time just to double check things, because sometimes, for instance, we had a situation where one of the Scantrons just didn't get scanned through properly by the testing center. And so it got lumped into a bunch of all the other Scantrons, and it took me a minute to find it, and I had to hand grade it. So it's nothing should be missing, but I want to make sure that if there's something that looks weird, let me know. Also, don't forget that Connecting with Biology assignment's due on the 1st. So that is coming up rather quickly. You only have about 10 more days to do that. And I've already seen about 5 people that have submitted it out of like 430 something. So you may want to get working on that. It's really not that hard of an assignment. It shouldn't take you more than an hour to do. And it's a lot less difficult than taking another test or something. So take advantage of those kinds of opportunities, because the whole point of those assignments is to, one, give you an exposure to what biology looks like actually practically, and not having to rely entirely on tests for your grade, because unfortunately it's kind of hard to do that with 450 people. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to be talking about forces of evolutionary change. So over the past couple lectures, we've been talking about things like meiosis, right? And how that yields all these different combinations of genetic diversity. And we've been kind of prefacing this that, genetic diversity is important because you need to have a bank of information, a lot of different options, if you will, if you want to change and modify your body plan to suit whatever environment that you're living in. Now, one thing to keep in mind when we talk about evolution is that generally from a biological perspective, we usually don't think of it as something that's being controlled. It's kind of something that happens somewhat as random happenstance. And the factors that can push evolution in one way can push it in another way just as easily. And it just can flip on a dime in some cases. For instance, probably one of the best examples of this is there's a moth that was originally found in the forests of Great Britain. Now, prior to the 1800s, those areas were fairly clean and as clean as it could be. And as a result, a lot of the trees had kind of a white gray bark color. And over time, as the Industrial Revolution happened, you had all this coal ash and crap just getting spewed into the environment. It darkened the colors of the tree bark and gave it more of a gray or black look. And as a result, you have this like black moth that's now appearing. It's the same species, but the black color morph was doing better. Now, after the 1970s and 80s, where we had a lot of introduced legislation that handles environmental protection and that sort of thing, those trees are kind of getting their original color back. And as a result, you're getting a lot more of those white moths coming back into the population. And all that stuff can happen in a very quick time scale, whether that be a couple hundred years or even 10 to 15 years, just depending on the situation. So today we're going to be talking about some of the actual forces that change that and drive these evolutionary patterns that we see. So why exactly study evolution? Now, obviously, evolution, based off of how we understand things, is based off of a wide range of evidence. Even if you don't want to look back at fossils and all that kind of fun stuff, you can watch evolution happening on a day-to-day basis across, island chains and all this kind of fun stuff, where you take a population, you isolate it, and you introduce it into new circumstances. For instance, a really cool example of this that's happened in the last 10 years is that cane toads, those big bufo toads that you see around Miami and what have you. When they were introduced to Australia in the 1950s and 60s, they looked very similar to the ones that we have here in Florida. Big, fat, plump, don't really move around a whole lot. They're just kind of there. However, due to the environmental pressures of living in Australia, they've had to evolve to be faster, more agile, and as a result, they're skinnier, leaner, and just a meaner cane toad variant than we've ever seen before. There's really cool genomics and all this kind of fun stuff that show why this is the case, but you can still see this evolution happening on a 10 to 15-year basis. And thus, like the changes that we associate with evolution, even if you don't want to go that far back from whether it be biblical perspective or whatever, there's still evidence for evolution occurring right now. So thus, evolution offers an explanation for the life diversity that we have. The features seen in all these different organisms on Earth have arrived either independently or from the same shared common ancestor. And by understanding how all that stuff is interrelated, we can start making judgments and potentially handle conservation aspects, just depending on the situation. Now, evolution is generally considered to be a genetic change over time. Ultimately, evolution occurs when there are changes to heritable traits from generation to generation. And there's a lot of different ways this can happen, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a complete mutation in the genome. You can just have what you're being coded for change over time. So have different alleles show up at different points in time, or different alleles become more useful based off of whether or not they're useful in a particular environment. Going back to that moth example, for instance, it may not have been advantageous to be a dark colored moth at that time period when there was very white, colorful trees. But now that those trees darkened up because of all the coal ash, now it's more beneficial to have that black coloration. And thus that allele frequency changed. It went from being predominantly white coding alleles to predominantly black coding alleles in that moth species. Now, evolution occurs generally in single or multiple populations all at once. So a single population may not, if you're comparing like across multiple populations, you may have situations where population A is going a very different direction than population B. And basically there are things that can happen where, say, for instance, population A and B got split by population A ending up in an island, or humans moving population A somewhere else. That kind of thing can then cause different reactions. So say, for instance, environment A is different from environment B. They're going to kind of evolve to suit those particular areas. Now, in a population, these allele frequencies change from one generation to the next. And some alleles become more common while others become less common. Again, it just depends on what's more advantageous, what's more fit to have a particular allele. I do want to point out that you often hear this phrase survival of the fittest, or the fittest, usually expressed when you're talking about evolution, right? It's not entirely accurate, or at least how you perceive it usually is. When you think survival of the fittest, you think of the biggest, baddest, strongest animals overpowering the weak, vulnerable animals. But that's not really the case. It's often based off of fitness in a more biological context, which means that that animal is reproducing and surviving. And the strategies in which they do that are a lot more varied than just being the biggest, baddest version of that animal. For instance, you have some animals that have developed what we call sneaker strategies, where as a male, they will act as a female, give entire body colorations and all this stuff to look like a female fish or what have you, sneak into a harem, impregnate a bunch of fish, and then swim away. It's really kind of cool and fascinating, but it's interesting to see how these different relationships form, and what's fit doesn't necessarily always fit what we define fitness as, is kind of more colloquially. Now, these allele frequencies can vary pretty strongly depending on population. So here in humans, you have, say, for instance, in Asia, you have a frequency of alleles that produce black hair is a lot higher than it is in a lot of other places on Earth. For instance, this allele frequency that we're going to be calculating would be based off of the number of copies of allele versus the total number of alleles for the same gene population. So say, for instance, if we want to get away from human examples, if I want to know how many frogs, just see this example, have green skin versus brown skin. What you would do is you calculate the total number of alleles for green skin over the total number of alleles in that population that code for either green or brown skin. And that's what will give it that difference. As a result, evolution is very detectable by examining the gene pools. By looking at all the alleles that are present in the population and the proportions of those alleles, we can determine just kind of what direction the population is going in a given particular circumstance. Let's do a quick review question. Which of the following can evolve according to that biological definition of evolution that we've been talking about? A group of fir trees in Oregon, Earth's climate, a single fly as it develops from a larvae to an adult, a fossilized turtle, or a cell in your body whose DNA develops mutations as a result of exposure to X-rays. I'll give you all a second to think on it, and then we're going to talk about why each one of these things is or isn't correct. All right. Y'all ready? Cool. All right. So let's start with B for particular reasons. So obviously when we're talking about Earth's climate, right, we're talking about a bunch of different things that all don't really necessarily have to do with life. Can a rock evolve? This isn't Pokemon. The answer is no. A rock cannot evolve. All right. What about a single fly as it develops from a larvae to an adult? No. And I use this example quite often. That would be evolution in the Pokemon world, but that's metamorphosis in real life. That's development. That's changing from an adult or from a juvenile form to an adult form. And thus, as a result, C is not correct. Let's talk about D. Why is D not correct? It's dead. Not only is it dead, but it's a single turtle by itself, right? A single animal can't evolve. A population can evolve, but a single animal can't do it by itself. And finally, a cell in your body whose DNA develops mutations as a result of exposure to X-rays. There's one caveat to this that could affect it and actually make it evolution over time. But just to get away from all that stuff, what's the primary reason why, if you alter one specific cell line in your body, that particularly if it's not a gametic cell line, that's not evolution? What are the only types of cells that get passed from parent to offspring? Starts with G. Gamete cells, right? Let's say this affects your liver cell. That's a somatic cell, right? That's not the type of cell that's going to be passing its genetic information down to your offspring or what have you. In that case, D is also incorrect. So clearly the answer is A, a group of fir trees. And again, this is because it's a population in a very specific place. And over time, that area can be acted upon by the environment. And as a result, those trees might evolve to suit that environment better or worse. It kind of depends on the situation. Ultimately, a bunch of different scientists have contributed to this theory of evolution. Obviously, everybody associates Darwin in particular. However, around the exact same time, Alfred Wallace, was finding very similar patterns in a bunch of different beetles and bird populations in the Melanesian and Micronesia and a bunch of other places in like the Southwest Pacific Islands that kind of range from Asia down to Australia. And as a result, both of them relatively around the same time came to the conclusion that ultimately evolution changes over time. There's a bunch of other versions of this as well. Mark, for instance, mentioned that evolution happens from like a population thing based off of changes over the lifespan of a particular organism. In other words, the reason why a giraffe, for instance, has a really long neck is because over time, its parents stretched its neck out, and then its grandparents stretched their necks out, and that sort of thing. And so it's this gradual change, not from a genetic perspective, but from just kind of odd things happening in the environment. It's not entirely incorrect, but predominantly incorrect, unfortunately. But again, this goes all the way back to even Aristotle, who just noticed there were individuals of a species that were basically identical, but were still unchanging. So it's a lot of cool different kind of mechanisms to see how all these things arose and why we think particular things about evolution and biology. Now, one thing that greatly helped this are fossil discoveries. So up until about the late 1800s, we assumed that all life on Earth was the life on Earth that existed when we got here. And that's somewhat comes out of like a Christian, Judeo-Christian biblical context. But basically things like dinosaurs and all that kind of stuff were thought to be mythical creatures. If you've ever seen the skull of an elephant, or ultimately a mammoth, it kind of has this very odd look to it, where it's very long and tall, and it almost looks like it has a central eye socket in the middle of it, just based on the way its structure is. More than likely, this was misinterpreted by people in ancient Greece and ancient Rome as things like cyclopses. Or if you think about it, what also, like a dragon, has a big reptilian-looking head with giant teeth? Dinosaurs. Things like T-Rexes or Allosauruses or things like that were probably often confused for dragons and things like that were just kind of assumed to have died out, 100 years ago, and not actually, given context for what they actually were. Now, it took a lot of time and a lot of hand-wringing to get to the point where we are now, where we can see very clear relationships between the dinosaurs that existed 65 million years ago, the birds that are roaming around our campus today. But a lot of that was related to geologists discovering that different rock layers reveal different groups of fossilized organisms. In other words, indicating different time periods of when these things were laid down, as well as many of them now being extinct or having very similar forms to what was extinct previously. But probably the greatest influence for what we ultimately defined as evolution comes from Charles Darwin in his book On the Origin of Species. Now, all of this information came from a voyage that he took when he was rather young, about y'all's age, if not a little bit older. He's a very privileged white guy who, instead of having to work a real job, got to hop onto a boat, sail around the world, and just document things as a naturalist. He had no formal training, nothing. 1800s were wild, y'all. And as a result, he documented a great variety of organisms, particularly in South America, and the relationships of both fossils and geology. For instance, he documented some of the first giant ground sloths. Great example, think of the critter from Ice Age. That's ultimately what became our boring sloths that are now kind of cute. At one time, they were giant 20 feet tall plant-eating machines that could kill people pretty regularly, with claws about the size of that little desk table there. So as a result, he took all these clues together and used that to determine how new species originated, particularly with one location. He was ultimately able to use places like the Galapagos Islands to determine how things like plant availability, disease, and other things limit the size of populations. And he reasoned that in any population, individuals that can't obtain essential resources would die. And thus the ones that could were the ones that are going to live on. Ultimately, he used this to propose an idea called descent with modification. So the classic example that everybody thinks about is the finches from the Galapagos Islands, where he saw that all their different beak types matched up with the type of food that they ate. And ultimately, Darwin thought that these different finch types probably came from a single finch ancestor that arrived at the Galapagos sometime probably 10 million years ago, and then branched out to fill all these different niches based off of what plants were available. Now, Darwin saw that the environment of each island influenced that survival and reproduction rates of the finches as well. And thus the finches with features best suited for the environment were better able to survive, reproduce, than others. And as a result, he called this natural selection, that survival of the fittest that we keep on mentioning. Now, there is a form of this that we're quite familiar with, actually, artificial selection. For instance, a wild mustard plant, this boring little green flower with those yellow, or boring green plant with those little yellow flowers, has been selected for over generation and generation and generation and generation to generate a bunch of very specific foods. For instance, from the stem of the flower, we get things like broccoli. From the lateral buds, we get things like Brussels sprouts. From the flower clusters, we get things like cauliflower. From the leaves, you get kale. And finally, from the terminal bud, you get things like cabbage. All of these things come from the same species of plant. It's just been bred over and over and over in particular generations to maximize what we specifically want out of the specific plant. This again is called artificial selection, which is where we use selective breeding to kind of force evolutionary change in a particular direction. A great example of this, and one is very well documented to this day and unfortunately causes a lot of issues, is things like AKC breeding. If you've ever seen a picture of an English bulldog from the 1950s, they look like almost a completely different dog than they do today. And as a result, there's some things that have only developed recently, particularly when it comes to health, that we now have to deal with. A lot of the massive issues of hip dysplasia and German Shepherds and all that kind of fun stuff are based off of how we kind of have pushed toward this ideal artificially selected parameters that we want for these dogs to fit. And we're finding a lot of cases where we're now doing that to other species as well. For instance, like the 1990s, there was a Russian researcher that just decided that they wanted to have domesticated foxes. And over 20 years, they were able to take these completely wild foxes that have been in the pet or in the fur trade and turn them into domesticated foxes that kind of like dogs, where they no longer have the pointed ears. They now have these rounded floppy ears like you'd see in a puppy dog. It's weird how these little changes that are associated with behavior can often result in physical manifestations as well. Now, humans commonly will artificially alter allele frequencies. And so in artificial selection, the human is going to choose desired features and then allow only the individuals that best express those qualities to reproduce. In other words, if you're looking for tameness, you're going to look for the friendliest, best individual that exemplifies tameness in a particular generation, and you're going to breed that individual to the next best individual, that sort of thing. Ultimately, this increase in frequency of desired alleles can have problematic effects. Because obviously, evolution isn't always perfect. It's not like by adjusting one thing, you're only adjusting that one thing. You can often adjust a bunch of other things in the process. And how a single gene can code for multiple different things in your side of your body, that kind of happens to your dogs too. Now, kind of getting back to the mechanisms for evolution here, Darwin proposed natural selection as the mechanism for evolution. So for instance, here's the logic of this example here. So here's the observation of nature, right? So genetic variation. So within a species, no two individuals are exactly alike. There is some evolution in the heritability, right? And you can see this pretty readily. You go outside and you'll get all the little brown anoles that are scurrying across campus. You'll notice that their colorations on their back are pretty different. You can have solid colored ones. You can have ones that have little diamonds across their back, that sort of thing. And who knows how valuable those evolutionary adaptations could be in particular environments. The other thing you need to have is limited resources. Obviously, every habitat contains a limited amount of supplies for resources required for survival. You need to have some sort of limiting factor there. And finally, the overproduction of offspring. In other words, more offspring that are born than survive to reproduce. And this happens in pretty much every organism, except for humans for the most part, because humans are very odd when it comes to evolution. And it makes it very difficult to study humans from that perspective. And ultimately, these are going to influence a lot of different things based off of these observations. So for instance, you have this struggle for existence. Individuals are going to compete for limited resources that enable them to survive. You're going to have unequal reproductive success. That's that natural selection we're talking about, where some individuals are better able to adapt than others and are better able to acquire resources than others. And finally, you get that descent with modification. Those individuals that were best and most successful are going to be the ones passing on your genes. And as a result, those are the things that are going to become fixed in a population. Now, like I said, Darwin and Wallace kind of laid the foundation for all of this. Both scientists independently came to this idea of natural selection after years of studying nature, something in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 years. And while there is somewhat of a scandal about whether Darwin knew that Wallace was publishing this, it sounded like, based off of the way things have been read over time, and particularly people that have studied the works of Alfred Wallace and Charles Darwin, both of them came to the same point independently. It's just when Darwin saw an early draft of Wallace's manuscript and was like, oh shit, I've been sitting on this for 20 years, I should probably publish it, that kind of kicked it into high gear a bit. Now, all of this evolutionary theory is supported by data. So over years, a large body of careful research into many different fields of science has corroborated and expanded on all these findings to definitively say, yes, evolution is happening. It's happening on both a micro scale and a macro scale, and it's pretty easy to follow. However, This theory continues to expand today. In modern evolutionary synthesis, we include what scientists have learned since Darwin's time, particularly about genetics. Just keep in mind, Darwin was in the 1800s, right? He died, I think, in right around the turn of the century for the 1900s. So in other words, he was 50 years away from Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin to finding what DNA is. And he was probably 90 to 100 years away from the actual Human Genome Project and things like that. So a lot of modern evolutionary scientists incorporate those kinds of mechanisms into those studies so they can see not only from a general phenotypic expression of traits, but an actual genotypic expression as well. Now, those heritable traits are passed on in our DNA, right? It goes all back to that central dogma of biology. And ultimately, DNA mutations, sexual reproduction, and all these other things are continuous sources of heritable variation. In other words, you have all these extra offspring, they have all this extra diversity, and the things that are successful are the ones that are going to continue to reproduce. And finally, genetic variation is the raw material that evolution acts on. If you don't have that variability, there's no way you can actually have any evolution to occur. So for instance, things that go through a population bottleneck, where you take, say, 10 individuals that don't have a whole lot of genetic diversity out of a population of 1,000 and move them somewhere else and start a population with them, they're not going to have that basis, all that extra genetic variability that you'd see in that population of 1,000 to be able to branch out and do their own thing. And in fact, this is something that we think about a lot in zoos in particular, because one of the important parts of zoos, right, is to make sure you're maintaining a representative of what the population looks like in the wild. That's really important because, especially in the last 20 to 30 years, a big part of zoos is the conservation aspects, right? They're trying to raise animals that could potentially be released back onto the wild landscape. And as a result, we've had to develop some really interesting techniques, whether it be artificial fertilization, gene bank storing of sperm cells for like 30 or 40 years, all these kinds of things. And as a result, it's been able to, I think there was a really cool example of this that happened last semester, where Przewalski's wild horse, which is extinct in the wild, it has a population of about 100 animals in zoos. The San Diego Zoo was able to take frozen sperm that was collected from a male horse back in like the 1960s. Its genetic line wasn't represented at all. Take that, use it in an adult female that was born in like 2020. And as a result, they were able to generate a brand new offspring that had completely new novel genetics from something that hadn't been touched in years. This is especially important because a lot of animals sometimes just don't choose not to breed. There's a couple of classic examples of this. Pandas in particular are kind of pain in the ass. That's another reason why, yet again, I hate pandas. But all this stuff kind of matters. And like I've kind of been alluding to, evolutionary theory is often misunderstood. There's an overwhelming evidence that supports the theory of evolution by natural selection, but of course there are still some misconceptions about it that exist. And here's just kind of a brief example of some of these. I'm not going to ask you to remember these. Ultimately, if I hear you say evolution is a theory, though, we're going to have issues. All right. So which of these following statements support the concept of natural selection? A, individuals with the traits that are best suited for prevailing condition tend to leave more surviving fertile offspring. Or B, traits that increase survival and reproduction in the current generation will be more common in the next generation. Then either both are correct or none are correct. It's pretty straightforward, right? These both factor into what we consider to be natural selection, right? The answer is A and B. Now, natural selection molds evolution. It doesn't necessarily create alleles. Instead, it strongly selects for alleles that are going to rise by chance. In other words, there's some alleles just by pure happenstance that are better in a particular environment than they are in others. For instance, the seahorse alleles that you see are producing a phenotype that allows it to blend in with its surroundings, which is really useful for evading predators. In other words, it went from a more brownish color to that bright pink color, and as a result, it can blend right into that coral. It's really hard to see that if you're just a fish looming over the reef. And as a result, they were probably more likely to survive than individuals that were a darker coloration or didn't have as many bumps on them. Now, ultimately, this natural selection is going to require genetic variation. Since more individuals are born than resources can support, the struggle to survive is inevitable, right? Now, some individuals in a population are better than others at surviving and reproducing, and ultimately, they're going to be the ones that are going to be passing their genetics along. Now, adaptations enhance reproductive success. This is basically anything that we refer to as a trait that's going to be more beneficial for increasing fitness for a particular organism. So adaptations are heritable features that improve an organism's ability to survive and reproduce. For example, some people produce more gametes than others, and as short-term changes in an individual do not constitute evolution. So for instance, if we're talking about going back to that first review question, right? If you have an X-ray that alters your liver cells, that's not going to be passed down in your gametes. It's not going to be actual true evolution. That's not an adaptation, that's just there. Probably one of the classic examples of this is antibiotic resistant bacteria, which is where bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics have had an adaptive trait that's arisen kind of artificially or randomly in the population. And as a result of higher increased prescriptions of antibiotics, it's gone through and done a wide swath of killing off anything that can't resist it. And thus, a lot more bacterial cells have evolved to be more bacterial or antibiotic resistant, particularly things like staph infections and that sort of thing. Now, adaptive alleles become more frequent in population over time. So say if we're talking about this antibiotic example, you've got this one allele that occurred in a single mutation, allows for antibiotic resistance, right? And if you keep on just hitting that population over and over and over again with the antibiotics, that allele is going to become much more common. And that's why you see those changes in that population and ultimately the evolution of that population. Ultimately, in theory, natural selection is going to eliminate poorly adapted phenotypes. Now, keep in mind, it doesn't mean that these phenotypes, the ones that survive, are perfect. In fact, they're oftentimes pretty shitty. Again, going back to my panda example, why in the hell is a panda adapted to eat the tiniest little parts of the bamboo plant? I'll never understand. But for some odd reason, it's evolved to fit that very weird specific niche. And nobody really has a good example or reason for it. Now, as a result of environmental conditions changing, the phenotypes that natural selection will favor can also change. So adaptations that seem perfect in one environment will be completely wrong in another. This is often called an evolutionary trap because they've evolved to fit this very particular circumstance. And once they're introduced to a brand new circumstance, it screws up everything. A great example of this. How many of y'all live on the beach or live near a beach here in Florida? How many of you have seen the signs that say, hey, you can't have white or blue light, you have to have red light now during the night? You ever wondered why that is? I mean, obviously you think of it, it's usually associated with sea turtles, right? Well, let's talk about this, right? Now, say you're a sea turtle 1,000 years ago. What is the one bright light you're going to be seeing on the coast? The moon. Usually the moon is out over the water, correct? What direction do you want to go to? The water. So what happens when you introduce a bunch of artificial light that are now shining on the opposite direction of the beach? Yeah, those little sea turtles are going to crawl into the bushes and get killed off by all the crabs and raccoons and all that kind of fun stuff. So that's why they tell you not to have white light out on the beach in the middle of the night. There's a reason for it. And that evolutionary trap that sea turtles have evolved makes them kind of shitty to live in modern world now. And there are some cases too, though, where organisms have evolved to fit human habitats very, very well. Classic example of this is there are coyotes that have somehow behaviorally learned to hunt during the day in the suburbs, hunt during the day in the middle of a city, and then ride the subway back to the suburbs to sleep at night. It's a really fascinating situation. It's primarily in Chicago where we document this, but there are literally coyotes that will wander their way into the subway station, ride in for the day, eat as much crap as they can from all the dumpsters and all that stuff, and then ride it back out so they don't die at night. Absolutely fascinating. Now, unfortunately, natural selection can eliminate entire species. Sometimes there's just circumstances where it sucks to have those particular traits. For instance, if you were a dinosaur 65 million years ago, you had a fairly large body type. And when that meteor struck down in the Gulf of Mexico, it increased a huge amount of dust into the sky, causing massive increase or decreases in the overall global temperature. And it's a lot harder to heat up much bigger body masses than it is to heat up smaller body masses that are covered in fur or covered in feathers. So the dinosaurs that did survive, the birds, were the small versions, right? And the mammals that survived were small organisms that were able to burrow underground and stay warm through their hair and have smaller body sizes. Those big, massive animals that we associate with the end of the Cretaceous, like T-Rex and all the big, long-necked dinosaurs, they died out just because they weren't adapted for that environment anymore. Now, a big thing to keep in mind with this is evolution doesn't have a goal. There's no endpoint. It's all just kind of continuous. And so you can always end up back at the beginning, so to speak. In other words, if something changes and you're no longer able to adapt to it, you're game over. But as long as you're continually able to adapt, you may change your form over time. For instance, here you have this orchid and a wasp pollinator that have evolved alongside one another. Now, ultimately, this orchid does not evolve to be better pollinated by the wasp, and the wasp doesn't evolve to be better situated to that orchid. It's just all these happenstance things occur, and the wasps that were able to access that orchid were just better able to get resources for themselves, and they survived. There's no plan. There's no overarching goal. There's no puppet master behind the curtain. Now, fitness is ultimately just reproductive success. By itself, survival is not enough for evolutionary fitness. Fitness depends on the ability to reproduce, that passing of the genetic information from one generation to another. Another quick question here. Now, many plants require moisture to reproduce. What will happen if a plant population during a prolonged drought? A, some of those plants are going to require ability to reproduce without water. B, if none of the plants can reproduce without water, the population may go extinct. Or C, those plants are already going to reproduce without water, will pass on their alleles to the next generation, others will not. Let's kind of just talk through these things real quick. So if none of the plants can reproduce without water, the population may go extinct. That's pretty straightforward, right? So if there's no water present and the plant needs it to survive, that plant population is gone. Those plants that can already reproduce without water will pass on their alleles to the next generation, while the others that can't will not. That's pretty straightforward, right? That's just natural selection. That makes total sense. What about A? So some of the plants will acquire the ability to reproduce without water. If we're talking about a single generation, that's just not possible, right? There's not some magical mutation. There's not some spider that's going to bite Peter Parker. It's just kind of how it is. At this point, they're kind of SOL. So they either need to have that allele present or they're going to die out. So in this case, D, B, and C are correct is a correct answer. Now, evolution is not only possible, but it's unavoidable. Even frequencies, allele frequencies in human populations are massively changing, and especially in places where you have a lot of immigration and emigration in and out of populations. This is both true for humans, it's true for animals, it's true for everything. So in real populations, allele frequencies will always inevitably change over time because they're affected by so many selective forces. Now, science can test for evolution. Scientists test evolution and measures by measuring usually the allele frequency and measuring it from one generation to the next to see how much it changes or if it changes at all. So in this hypothetical population of ferrets, allele big D produces dark fur, while allele little d produces that light fur. And ultimately, by counting the alleles, allows us to calculate their frequencies. And then we can use something called Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which is basically a way that we can compare. We know if, say, for instance, you have very specific alleles and it's two versions of it, you can predict whether or not a population is evolving by whether or not they stay in Hardy-Weinberg. So if they stay in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, that means the population is not changing, it's not experiencing evolution at that time. However, if it's getting kind of disproportionate levels of particular alleles, that population is now considered outside of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, which means that population is actively evolving towards another direction. And ultimately, it can be compared to real populations to see if that evolution is occurring. In order for this to work, though, it requires a number of very specific assumptions. For instance, a population meeting all the assumptions below is said to be at Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So ultimately, here's the basic ones here. No random mating, or you need to have random mating, no migration, no genetic drift, mutation, or natural selection. That's what ultimately is going to cause Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So if you don't have those things acting, you're not going to have a change in the population, right? And ultimately, you can use a couple different formulas to calculate the allele and genotype frequencies. So for instance, if you want to know the allele frequency, you take the proportion of the dominant allele and you add that to the proportion of the recessive allele. And in theory, that should equal 1 because there's only 2 options, right? And you can add, more slots based off of how many alleles are present for a particular gene. You can then look at the genotype frequency. So if you know what the phenotype is, based off of the fact that in theory, right, you have a number of homozygous recessives, homozygous dominants, and heterozygous individuals, you can use this calculation to basically say p to the squared, p squared plus 2pq plus q squared will give you 1. That's basically saying the proportion of the frequency of the DD genotype, the frequency of the big D little d genotype, and finally the frequency of the little d genotype. All of that should ultimately lead up to 1, and you can see how that math works out. And like I mentioned, allele frequencies always change. So in real populations, the assumption of Hardy-Weinberg are often violated, meaning that evolution is taking place. And as a result, natural selection and mutations do occur. Random changes in allele frequencies are common, and individuals rarely mate at random. There's always some level of migration between populations. All of these things are being broken. And as a result, we get different results. Here's another example here. So a population of 100 starfish is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. A trait for long arms is completely dominant. And in this population, you have 40% of all the alleles for this trait are recessive and 60% of all the alleles are dominant. How many individuals would you expect to be homozygous dominant? So basically, we would go back to that calculation here, and you would use that to basically say that 0.6 times 0.6, because we know that that's what the population that has those long arms has. That's going to give us 0.36. So we know that there are 100 starfish. We can just multiply it by 100. That's where you get that 36 individuals. And don't worry too much about this. I'm not going to ask too much about this. Now, natural selection can shape populations over time in a variety of different shapes. So there's 3 different types that we primarily consider when we're talking about natural selection. You have directional selection, disruptive selection, or stabilizing selection. And how it affects the particular amount of alleles and what specific alleles are going to be more likely selected for depends on the kind of selection that you're experiencing. So here, for instance, talking back to that moth example, if you have kind of a nice balance mix between light, medium, and dark colored moths, and the habitat changes, you get those darker trees that I was mentioning, it's going to push that curve farther to that dark end of the spectrum, right? So you get a lot more individuals with that darker allele. But you can also have disruptive selection, which is where you go from a single nice classic bell curve to 2 bimodal curves. Basically, for instance, if you're talking about these snails, you go light, medium, dark for their coloration. All of a sudden, the habitat changes and the mix of light, it basically removes all those dark colored rocks out of the equation. It's only light or dark. And you end up with increased amount of light, increased amount of dark, and you lose that medium selection there. Now, finally, with stabilizing selection, the middle of the curve usually doesn't move very much. But as a result, the extremes come towards the end. So you'll notice it's a nice wide swath curve there, but over time it's kind of crunched in. And that's what you're seeing with stabilizing. It's pushing towards a very specific option. And again, that directional selection is going to favor one phenotype over another. There's specifically, for whatever reason, a specific phenotype is better than any of the other ones present. With disruptive selection, it's going to favor those extreme phenotypes. And with stabilizing selection, it's going to favor that intermediate phenotype, that perfect middle ground. So why are harmful alleles sometimes maintained in a population? For instance, things like sickle cell disease or some of the really nasty genetic traits that you see that sometimes come out in, say, California condors or Florida panthers as a result of conservation with having this tiny little population. Well, one example of explanation for why these harmful alleles persist is something called heterozygote advantage, which is where heterozygotes are favored over homozygotes. For instance, specifically with sickle cell disease, if you're heterozygous for it, you're much more likely to survive malarial infection than if you're homozygous recessive or homozygous dominant. However, if you're homozygous recessive, you're probably going to get pretty sick. And if you're it basically kind of works out to where you have your heterozygous individuals, homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive. If that makes sense. Again, you can get a little bit more into specifically why that happens. So we'll skip that real quick. Another thing that can directly influence reproductive success, like we've kind of mentioned, is sexual selection. Building complex nests, flashing showy plumage, butting heads with rival males, and all waste energy, right? It's completely useless. Except for if you need to try to please the member of the opposite sex. Humans do this just as frequently as everything else does, but because there's a big difference between the person that shows up nicely dressed to a date that doesn't smell like they haven't showered in a week to the person that hasn't. But that sexual selection can be a force that strongly favors traits that are apparently reduced survival. So sexual selection results in a variation in the ability to obtain mates. For instance, this can include competition to the access of the other sex. Things like rams and beetles are going to compete with each other, or from one sex choosing the attractive mates over the other sex. Particularly in birds, the female bird is more responsible for basically determining if there's going to be reproductive happening than any other situation from what I remember. More often than not, you have very strongly driven female-derived sex choice in birds because for whatever reason, it's just kind of evolved that way. Here's a great example of this. So individuals with sexually selected traits are going to be more likely to mate and therefore pass along their genes. And thus this mating is not random. And since Hardy-Weinberg does not apply, evolution occurs. For instance, male birds of the paradise have evolved these brightly colored feathers to attract females. And you can see very similar things like peacocks, right? I know some of y'all found some just wandering around Oviedo. If you think about it, the train at the back end, that tail for a peacock, for a male peacock, is the most useless piece of shit ever. It's giant, it's colorful, it attracts predators, it gets in your way when you're trying to fly, all these kinds of things. But because that bird needs to have that big, bright, beautiful plumage to attract females, that's why it still persists. You know, same thing with a lot of deer. Male deer need to have those big, beautiful antlers because they're trying to show that they can put as much energy into something that means absolutely nothing, relatively speaking. And that way that you can clearly see they have that perfect amount of resources for being able to survive and reproduce. All right, we're going to stop here for today just because we're right on the edge of time. We only have like 10 more slides, but we can add that to the next lecture. As always, let me know if y'all have any questions, and don't forget you have quite a few things coming up here soon, so get on top of that.